Welcome to Optimus Minimus, and this is the first video in a series about the Scandalous emperors. And it deserves an introduction and an explanation. People like scandals, and that's something that attracts attention. There's a long tradition of telling ugly stories about the emperors of Rome. Obviously, there's always someone in history who's not a very likable character, which instantly makes him or her an object of public interest or righteous hatred. And sometimes in the pursuit of sensationalism, the facts are twisted and presented in a way that underlines the sins of the historical figure in question, while everything else is swept under the rug. And classical antiquity suffers a lot from this approach. For centuries, historians or religious figures tried to emphasize the decadence of Romans. And while some of the historical figures enjoyed a relatively untroubled posterity, others were interpreted as total monsters and entertained the crowd in this capacity. It is very easy to twist the facts if you really want to, but it becomes extremely easy if your sources are incomplete and leave a lot of room for imagination. And all of this happened a long time ago, so it doesn't have any direct political implications. When we're talking about the so-called scandalous emperors, and in our case it's Caligula, Nero, Commodus, and Elagabalus, the four horsemen of apocalypse, we must understand that there are serious problems with the sources, and pretty much in all of these four cases, to some extent we're dealing with the character assassinations. We have very fragmented and apparently very biased pieces of information, and we're trying to navigate there to the best of our ability. And sometimes it's hard because of the scarcity of the sources and because of a certain cultural inertia. You're trying to go through the sources and to imagine a more or less objective picture of what happened to, say, Caligula. And then 5 minutes later, another movie pops up that bluntly says that this guy has slept with his three sisters. The crowd goes wow, and then this totally unreliable or wildly exaggerated piece of information just goes straight into the heads of the general audience and stays there for another 100 years. So yeah, while I'm definitely trying to capitalize on the public interest for all things sensational, scandalous, and wild, at the same time, the purpose of those videos is to ask questions and sometimes to go against the distorted perceptions. In this series of videos, we're going chronologically, so we start with the first of those infamous emperors, and it's gonna be Caligula. Caligula is a very good illustration of the distortion of history and the biased approach. And this bias starts with his name. Caligula is not a name, it's a nickname. His name was Gaius. Indeed, the Roman naming conventions were quite complicated, and sometimes you have a number of characters whose names are almost identical. So historians are making certain shortcuts just to navigate through them and make things more convenient. If you have a guy whose name officially is something like Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus, it's hard to figure out who you're talking about exactly. You need short descriptions. But when most of the works refer to the emperor using his childhood nickname, that's a bit too much. You might think that it's not a big deal, really, but just let me give you a modern example to illustrate the problem. There were lots of kings of England, and it's really hard to navigate through them as well. The same problem is with the emperors of Rome. And many of the kings had identical names, so they just added numbers for the sake of convenience. Romans never did this, by the way. Well, in a way they did, but that's another story. So, back to the kings of England. There were lots of kings with the name George, 6 of them, and the last one, George the Sixth, was famously known to his family by his nickname, Bertie. Now, imagine that almost all of the books on the history of England or the British monarchy will list George VI as Bertie. You have Queen Victoria, then George V, then King Edward, and Bertie, like he was some kind of a mentally deficient child. And then you open a book on the history of Rome and see the emperor called Little Boots. That's what the word Caligula means. Caliga is a type of soldier's footwear. Most of the people probably don't even know that Caligula's name was Gaius. They probably think that Little Boots was the name. It wasn't. It is sometimes mentioned that Gaius didn't like the nickname and it was dangerous to address him as Caligula. But if you'll be granted the audience with Queen Elizabeth II, and you'll start calling her Lizzie and her deceased father Bertie, well, you'll probably be kicked out. And not because of the cruelty of the British monarchy or because of their madness. No, mostly because you're an idiot. So yeah, the problems with the portrayal of Gaius start with his name, and then once it's established how mad and pathetic he was, they slowly morph into the stories of his incestuous relationship with his sisters and all that. Sweet Home Alabama. Now let's take a look at the original sources on Gaius, not popular culture and modern interpretations. Just like with the other scandalous emperors and many other public figures as well, the sources are quite limited. There's always this layer of sources like inscriptions and obviously coins, but you should always be very cautious with the numismatic evidence. There's just inherently a lot of forgery going on. And inscriptions don't usually tell you the detailed story of the reign of an emperor. For that, we have historians. Also, since we're talking about the inscriptions and stuff, I'd like to remind you of a quote from Titus Livy. I believe that the true history has been falsified by funeral orations and line inscriptions on the family busts, since each family appropriates to itself an imaginary record of noble deeds and official distinctions. Okay, now, the historians. In the case of Mr. Little Boots, we have two main sources. And I will repeat this phrase once again. We have two sources. Most of the information you'll ever hear on Gaius is extracted from two works on the history of Rome. The rest is fragments from here and there, although sometimes these fragments are quite important. So the two primary sources are Suetonius and Cassius Dio. Suetonius and his De Vita Caesarum, usually known as the 12 Caesars, is an interesting book, but not very reliable. Suetonius is more interested in, again, sensationalism and pays a lot of attention to who slept with whom and all these tales of licentiousness. And he was born almost 30 years after the death of Gaius. Then we have Cassius Dio, who is usually seen as a more or less reliable and competent historian. He has a much better account on Gaius, but that's an account of a man who lived almost 2 centuries after Mr. Little Boots. And while Dio is generally considered a more trustworthy and more academic source than Suetonius, in reality he's not much better. But that's about it. Gaius is also mentioned here and there, but that's not really a story of his reign, just opinions. Most notably, he is mentioned by Seneca, who apparently didn't like Gaius at all. He's very biased, and it is your decision if you should trust the opinion of someone like Seneca and consider him a trustworthy person. Many people are skeptical about him for a number of reasons. As a huge admirer of his philosophical works, just for the record, I must say that I indeed consider Seneca a trustworthy source. In the case if the works that speak of Gaius are actually authentic. Out of all the sources we have on our hands, well, nobody likes Gaius. Yes, the sources are certainly biased and probably reflect the views of the senatorial class, and later the historical tradition and public condemnation of Gaius by his direct successors. And although, as I said before, we're trying to figure out what happened and don't pay attention to the wild propaganda and grotesque exaggerations, that doesn't mean that I'm here for radical revisionism. I'm not planning to suddenly make a statement that in fact Gaius was a brilliant statesman and a nice and virtuous human being. He probably wasn't. He probably was quite bad and relatively incompetent. Here's a short timeline of his reign. Well, his reign also was quite short, less than 4 years. Many prominent people of his age didn't like Little Boots and his behavior, and as we know, even the absolute monarchy is always limited by regicide. And Rome, well, Rome wasn't even an absolute monarchy, and officially it wasn't even the monarchy in the first place. Gaius became the emperor as an heir to Tiberius. According to Cassius Dio, he probably wasn't really his heir. Well, it's quite unclear. There's a passage in Dio's history that can be interpreted at least in two different ways. Either Gaius was named as a co-heir together with the grandson of Tiberius, his name was Tiberius Gemellus, or Gemellus was actually the only heir. Anyway, with the full consent of the Senate, because it is the Senate that confirms the emperors, Gaius took power and later killed Gemellus. He didn't need any rivals. People liked Gaius because he was the son of a very popular general Germanicus. And it is generally believed that Germanicus was considered by Augustus as his successor. But Germanicus died when Gaius was something around 7 years of age. And anyway, the wife of Augustus, Livia, naturally favored her own son, Tiberius, and pushed him in the direction of the imperial office as other potential and official heirs to Augustus were dying. And it seems they were dying without any assistance from Livia, just natural causes, illness, unfortunate circumstances, or even old age. I mean, Augustus lived a really long life, and many of his heirs managed to expire before him. Anyway, people remember Germanicus, and some of his popularity probably was inherited by his son. Most of his immediate family members suffered some serious persecutions from Tiberius, but Gaius managed to survive and actually was summoned by the old man himself. Actually, Gaius referred to Tiberius as his grandfather, at least for some time. And well, in a way, Tiberius was his grandfather, not just adopted grandfather. Gaius was a direct descendant of Augustus, his great grandson, and Tiberius was a stepson of Augustus, so Gaius was quite correct. It seems that Tiberius wasn't a very popular person, and some might say that he was mostly hated by the people, which is also believed to be one of the reasons why initially Gaius was welcomed by everyone. He just wasn't Tiberius. I'm not going to discuss here if Tiberius was really that unpopular or how good he was as the head of the state. I believe Tiberius was a very complicated figure and also a prominent subject of character assassination. But it is crystal clear that he was a far more competent emperor than Gaius. There is even an anecdote, obviously, of doubtful authenticity that Tiberius once exclaimed something like, "You think I'm bad? Wait until Gaius takes my place." There are also stories that Gaius poisoned Tiberius, but it is very doubtful, and Tiberius was a really old man. Initially, Gaius seemed to be a nice and respectful emperor, but then something happened. There can be numerous explanations for his slow transformation into a bad emperor, including first, he was quite young, he was 24. And as it's been pointed out many times, Roman emperors who took power before the age of 30 were not very good, with the possible exception of Severus Alexander and the very controversial figure of Domitian. So even if Rome wasn't really the absolute monarchy, the whole idea of I can do whatever I like and nothing's gonna happen to me, except maybe for assassination, it could be too much for a young person who never had a normal life and quite probably had certain problems with the upbringing and education. And this can easily be the case with Gaius. Most of his family died, he had a very troubled childhood, and in many ways he turned out quite damaged. And then he becomes very powerful and can get almost whatever he desires. So then you just abuse power and go down the road of degradation. ruin. Another possible explanation, which doesn't really contradict the first one, is illness. You should be very cautious when somebody, like a state appointed historian, tries to sell you a story of a mad king. Like, not metaphorically mad, but, a medical condition. Most of the time, it's just a lazy exaggeration or outright propaganda. But in our case, it actually can be a possible scenario, especially since the fruit of this scenario was quite believable and realistic. Short reign and assassination. That's what usually happens if you have a mad king. Nobody will tolerate an insane person on the throne. So we have this story that something like 6 or 7 months into the reign of Gaius, he had something like a brain fever. That's what they say. We don't know what it was, but quite probably it was meningitis. And Gaius was a different person after his illness, a person with a permanent brain damage. Pretty much everybody accuses Gaius of the truly licentious behavior. Both our historians paint vivid pictures of the man's depravity. And accusing someone of licentiousness was a prominent Greco-Roman sport. This is how you start a conversation with someone you don't like. So you have to be careful with this kind of information and avoid obvious exaggerations. Gaius was probably quite immoral and a sexual predator, but I wouldn't trust the stories about his very close relationship with his sisters, or the stories that he invited married couples of people from the senatorial class and then walked around staring at the wives, choosing the ones he likes the most, and then taking them with him, and then returning and publicly making remarks on what he liked and what he didn't during his uh, test drive. Sorry for mentioning that, but Suetonius is full of anecdotes of this sort, and it sounds quite unbelievable if you're thinking about it for a couple of minutes. And also, if you remember that Rome was an elective monarchy and the senatorial class was very powerful, and you don't really want to mess with it too much in a horrifyingly humiliating manner. His trials and even torture of the senators was enough to secure the hatred of the senators, but at least it probably looked like it has something to do with the law or investigations of the conspiracies against Gaius. Torture and clearly sadistical tendencies of Gaius are mentioned by Seneca, who had a very low opinion of Mr. Little Boots. So I don't dismiss the claims that Gaius indeed was a very angry man who liked to torture people. But there's a certain limit. He probably went over this limit at some point, which explains that there were a number of conspiracies to investigate. But it all ended quite soon. One of the conspiracies was successful. There is no doubt that there was a serious rift between Gaius and the Senate. This fact alone explains a lot and probably even everything. The plots against the emperor and subsequent tradition of presenting him as a monster. A tradition that was embraced by Cassius Dio because he worked with the earlier sources that were written with this agenda in mind. As I mentioned before, early in his reign, Gaius tried to be more or less moderate, and he started off with a move that was met with the universal acclaim from this senatorial class. He destroyed all of the papers and lists of the suspects left by notoriously and justifiably paranoid Tiberius. It is quite probable that it was actually one of the conditions for senatorial support, a clear indication that everything is forgotten and everything is forgiven. Gaius is starting from scratch and has no intention to continue the persecutions that Tiberius liked so much. But after a while, it was discovered that Gaius actually destroyed copies of the documents and left the originals to himself, which is actually understandable. Yes, he was a new emperor, but information collected by Tiberius could be quite valuable. Tiberius is frequently described as a monster as well, but you must keep in mind that he operated in some seriously complicated circumstances. His life and position were probably in serious danger, and the man managed to stay in power for more than 2 decades. Apparently, guys really liked to spend money left and right. The money left by Tiberius, who was far from being an incompetent ruler. And Gaius had a lot of ideas for weird and useless projects like giant ships and long pontoon bridges and huge feasts and games. Cassius Dio and Suetonius both say that Gaius spent incredible amounts of money to support his lavish lifestyle and basically left the treasury empty. Seneca even says that this squandering of the resources left enough bread in the Roman granaries only for 7 or 8 days. I'm not sure if it's directly related to the state of the economy, maybe just only to a seasonal shortage of food supplies, but it's worth mentioning. That said, although Gaius indeed could be a big spender, it never had a lasting effect on the economy of the state. It seems that almost none of the actions of Gaius really had any serious impact in the long run. He was no Commodus or, say, Caracalla, another guy with a nickname based on clothing. Like Nero after him, Gaius apparently was a sports fan and an admirer of arts, sort of. That's one of the things that the senatorial class found very repulsive because it contradicted its ideas of a behavior appropriate to the head of the state. So, yeah, every historian will obviously mention his indecent participation in such activities as dancing or driving the chariot or fighting as a gladiator. Although the latter wasn't probably that bad. I mean, if Gaius or Commodus goes into the arena as a gladiator, that's horrible, and the ancient historians scream how depraved this person was. But if Emperor Titus does the same, well, that's fine. Titus was a good guy. Everyone liked Titus. Why not? It's a totally different thing if you don't torture the members of the Senate under humiliating circumstances. Titus never did anything like that. And Gaius, well, military successes of Gaius or his administration were minimal, but not non-existent. People laugh at his failed attempt to start a campaign in Britannia, but he annexed Mauritania, so it's not nothing. Other than that, well, his disregard for the law, obscene behavior, and very, very bad relations with the Senate backfired at him. 4 years into his reign, he walked out of the theater and was assassinated. Legend tells us that once Gaius was killed, the soldiers looting his palace found there his terrified uncle Claudius, conveniently hiding behind the curtain, and they suddenly felt the irresistible urge of declaring him the emperor, and then took him to the Praetorian camp. And then the Praetorian Guard suddenly declared Claudius their emperor as well. So then, terrified and absolutely innocent Claudius, a total passenger here, was taken to the Senate. And suddenly the Senate approved the guy as the new emperor. Who could have thought? What an unpredictable chain of events, what a coincidence. 3 times in a row. Up to this day, there are debates whether Claudius was complicit in the assassination of Gaius. Honestly, I don't understand the nature of these discussions. Who was the main beneficiary of this assassination? Well, it was Claudius. And this is how Gaius perished and Claudius became the new emperor of Rome. And then he ate some mushrooms and turned into a pumpkin. But that's a different story. So, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Turn on the notifications because the next time we'll be discussing Nero. So, see you soon.